had 1,000 tongues, I'd use them all to praise the one who is my master and my king, the reason that I sing. He's my Savior and my God, who gives to all his matchless love. I'll never be ashamed of his holy name. Hallelujah.
General Conference. The last General Conference was held in Tampa in 2012. And as you can see from this second slide, that its theme was to make disciples of Jesus Christ to transform the world. General Conference occurs every 4 years on a regular basis. In United Methodist speak, that's called a quadrennium or quadrennial. Those words are not easily defined in the general vocabulary of the culture because they are very specific to United Methodist time. The quadrennium basically is the time between general conferences, and there are quadrennial emphases. For instance, in Portland in 2016, the General Conference will meet, and I believe that they are working around a theme like sent. And so here we have disciple making and transformation, which aligns almost word for word with the mission of the church. And then when we come to Portland in 2016, there will be a work around the notion of being sent. And there was, I believe it was in Fort Worth in 2008, they used one of Ruth Duck's hymns, Ruth Duck of this seminary, to frame the whole notion of water washed and spirit born, and that whole notion of what it is to be a disciple. And so today we come to talk about the General Conference and the general administration of the church through the general agencies. And that word general basically refers to not the national conference as it once did, nor do we use the word global conference, but general conference. And the general agencies refer to the administration of the whole church. It's interesting as we look at a move to a global church that we still utilize that notion of the general conference and the general agencies. Now, the General Conference is not referred to as as you recall, the Charge Conference in the local church being the most formative place for disciple making and where the church engages the world. Nor does it have that privilege of history and place that the annual conference has, which we have talked about a lot. But as the years go along, and as each quadrennium goes along, the General Conference becomes more and more of a focus of those in leadership of the church. It is because General Conference is the place where legislation that affects the entire body of the church is actually made. And that legislation, much like the debate in the United States of America, is the question of how large of an impact should General Conference have on the entire body of the church. And as we have said before, but I want to reemphasize it again, unlike in the United States, where there is a debate over the minimal powers of the federal government as provided by the Constitution, in the United Methodist Church, we are in a place where things do not happen unless they are brought into being by legislation. And often the question is, where is the best place for that legislation to occur? And because of the large impact of General Conference and more specifically the general agencies, more and more and more is there a focus on whether the general church needs to make those decisions or whether they are best located in the conferences, meaning the annual or central conferences. And so you have this big conversation that is going on about the importance of the book of discipline and what of the book of discipline is for the whole church, and whether, like the central conferences, that can amend or impact the central conference with a revised book of discipline, whether that should be exclusively for international conferences, the Philippines, Africa, and Eurasia. And if you look back at that map, there is a little bit of North Africa that is included in Europe. So those three major areas of the world. Whether the same thing is true of the 5 jurisdictions in the United States, that they should be able to amend the book of discipline, which is generally for the whole church, to be more fitting to their jurisdictional area. And that this clearly comes up around issues of inclusion, especially of the ordination of GLTBQ persons, because of the cultures of the various areas of the church may not effectively express what is most important in terms of our book of law or the book of discipline. And it is specifically what the General Conference is charged to do, which is to set priorities for the whole church, to adopt a budget that will support those priorities as they are given out to the general boards and agencies of the church, as well as monies that come to support the annual conferences. In order to do that, the General Conference meets generally for 2 weeks. It meets every 4 years, and it is fundamentally a legislative body. It moves every 4 years or every quadrennium to a different one of the 5 jurisdictions in the United States. And you can follow this path. So we were in Fort Worth in 2008, the South Central jurisdiction. We were in Tampa in 2012, which is the Southeast jurisdiction, of course. And now we will be in Portland in 2016, which is in the Western jurisdiction. And so you will see that in 2020 and 2024, we will be in the North Central and then in the Northeast jurisdiction. Many have said that the church will not truly become global unless the General Conference meets in one of the central conferences. And this will be a major move, not only to express its global nature, but also, as you can tell, it will have huge economic impact, and we'll get to that when we consider the very cost of the General Conference. As you can see in slide 3, we move through the scope of the General Conference, and we will stay on slide 3 for a little bit. It moves in the United States, as it says there in point 2. The delegates are elected to General Conference according to a membership ratio, meaning they take the entire membership of the United Methodist Church. They look at what percentage of that membership is in each of the annual conferences, and therefore the number of delegates that are to be elected come from the ratio or the percentage of members that are in that annual conference. So for instance, the Virginia Annual Conference has about as many delegates to General Conference as the entire Western jurisdiction, given the number of members that are there. And so there aren't equal numbers from each jurisdiction, but they are ratios in the annual conferences, and that's where the elections take place. Those elections to annual conference happen the year before a General Conference takes place, or, and Northern Illinois has considered this, they can happen 2 years before, so that there's 2 years for that delegation to get ready for the legislation that will come before it at General Conference. So those are elected at the annual conference. Now, Jurisdictional conference delegates, we talked about the jurisdiction last time, jurisdictional conference delegates are the general conference delegates, and then an equal number are elected in that annual conference, and both the general conference and an equal number above that, they become the delegates to jurisdictional conference, and then there are alternates also elected. There are an equal number of lay and clergy that are there. So as you can see, annual, jurisdictional, and general conference, the equality is of lay and clergy. There is an effort to have a good balance between men and women. There is also an effort to get a good balance between the various ethnic and racial groups within the church, and we will talk about the monitoring agencies that basically emphasize and monitor those very important things for the United Methodist Church. The history of the United Methodist Church since its founding is that General Conference is made up of 1,000 delegates. Well, that has been the tradition, and that is within the parameters that are laid out in the Book of Discipline. But it has been legislated or voted by the Commission on the General Conference that they reduce the number of delegates for 2016 to 850. And the rationale for that is the absolutely large cost to the denomination of the General Conference itself. The estimated cost of General Conference, even with the reduction to 850, the cost to the denomination for the General Conference in 2016 is going to top $14 million. $14 million for a 2-week meeting. And therefore, to reduce it to 850 rains that cost to $14 million, and it could rise dramatically if we go back to 1,000. You can imagine what would happen if the majority of delegates from the United States, which clearly is the lion's share of the delegates, were to make the move to go to one of the central conferences for General Conference. The cost just of travel alone and all of the other aspects of General Conference would be far in excess of that. And so many times our missional commitments are mitigated by the monetary cost, and we have to pray and think about what that means when we make our commitments. And I think many times it's worth paying the price, but that's my feeling about it. General Conference is a meeting of the global church. It is probably our greatest exposure to the press. And we make statements on behalf of the United Methodist Church there at General Conference. And so three things happen at that place. One is, it is a global gathering. And in addition to the 1,000 people that are there as delegates, you have the entire Council of Bishops, you have the Judicial Council, you have many members of the general boards and agencies that have carried on, and that's the general boards and agencies' work, is to carry on what has happened or what is legislated at General Conference. They carried on for the quadrennia, for the 4 years in between, as well as a large number of media and the press, as well as advocacy groups within the United Methodist Church who wish to make particular statements to point the direction of the church one way or another as it considers legislation and rewrites the Book of Discipline. What the General Conference votes and writes in the Book of Discipline, it does not then administer. That is left to the general boards and agencies, or it is commended to the annual conference and the local charge conference. It is not the executive. It does not then have the executive authority vested in its presiding officers to have a single executive to do that, although the Council of Bishops very dearly wanted in 2012 for the General Conference to legislate a single bishop to become the executive officer of the church. basically saying that we have a whole lot of stuff going on that is voted at General Conference, that we have general boards and agencies that are individually constituted and incorporated and do their work as they feel it has been given to them by the General Conference, but no single coordinating executive. And that was proposed and defeated because what the Judicial Council said was to have a set-aside bishop was to redefine who the bishops are. That bishops are bishops in the effective relationship because they preside in an area, and they were not predisposed to have a set-aside bishop as an executive. And so that General Conference is not its own executive, nor do we have an executive bishop. We do have something called the connectional table, which is a relatively new feature of the church. It's in its third quadrennium. And basically, we will have Amy Valdez Barker, the General Secretary of the Connectional Table, who will be here to talk about that. But as you hear, it is a table, a counseling, coordinating piece, but not an executive piece. At the General Council, all the legislation that comes through, the Judicial Council basically sits on the stage and rules whether it is constitutional what they have to do. And you will see in paragraphs 13 to 16 of the discipline and 17 and following what are the restrictive rules that govern what makes General Conference constitutionally sound. If you were following the 2012 General Conference, you will realize that many within the church believe that the church is too big in terms of its general agencies, it's too ungainly, it's too expensive, and it's not streamlined and effective at what it does. And there were various restructuring plans that were carefully considered, that were put before the body and actually voted to become the restructured body of the church, which failed because the Judicial Council ruled that they were not constitutional. The General Conference also adopts the foci for the church for the coming quadrennium. One General Conference cannot bind another General Conference in terms of its budget or what its foci might be. But in 2008, there were 4 pathways, they were called, 4 pathways for the church that were adopted. Now clearly we are outside the 2008-2012 quadrennium. But these 4 pathways were adopted for the church, and they continue through our current quadrennium, and they're seen to continue into the future. They were the urgent 4 pathways of the church, and through the balance of this lecture, we are going to hear an introduction and 4 United Methodist communications, 4 individual introductions to the 4 pathways. And before we head along with more about the General Conference itself, listen to the introduction that was made of these 4 pathways that guide the church and its general agencies and should guide us within the United Methodist Church, as we listen to the introductory video, which is part of the discussion that happened at General Conference 2008. Listen to the video and watch.
Where is God leading the people called United Methodists? What does our Wesleyan DNA ask of us? And are we responding, witnessing, and serving as our faith calls us to do?
We of Wesleyan descent have been part of a new conversation about our church's future. The question is, how do we take the best of what United Methodists do today and focus and grow that work so it becomes a source of inspiration for everyone? How can the church unify more completely to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world? The answer, a vision of ministry and mission that comes to life in the 4 areas of focus, which are developing principled Christian leaders for the church and the world, creating new places for new people and renewing existing congregations, engaging in ministry with the poor, and stamping out the killer diseases of poverty by improving health globally.
These 4 areas of focus are powerful avenues in which United Methodists far and wide can express their faith. These areas of focus are not envisioned for the next quadrennium, but as far as the eye can see.
At every level of the church, dialogue has already begun about the ways we can bring together vision, mission, and money.
It was like we were seeing a modern version of Jesus multiplying the loaves and the fishes. We started to appreciate the magnitude of our connection.
The first area of focus is developing principled Christian leaders for the church and the world.
Father, I want to pray.
We live in a world that once had courageous Christian leaders, but now cries out for them. The kinds of women and men who are set apart to show by example how to live faithfully in bold discipleship and to engage a world starving for the gospel.
We have many ideas to engage potential leaders, those rich with Wesleyan DNA, who crave something big and purposeful, who long for a chance to touch people's lives. Actions like these will energize future leaders and pave the way for church growth. The second focus area is creating new places for new people and renewing existing congregations.
In the area of church growth, the core of its DNA is a passion for the gospel and for younger people, more people, and diverse people. That passion for the people will lead us to start new churches and build vitality into existing churches.
All I want to do is see people come to Christ, see people's lives change, see people realize the power and the potential of the Word of God.
People are hurting in this world, and they really want to know that the Potter is willing to make them over again, anew, another.
The Path One initiative centers on starting new churches in the United States. It is part of the plan of action to increase church growth because building congregations is not about bricks and mortar.
El pueblo estaba demandando una reforma migratoria.
We as United Methodists are looking at ways to make certain that there will be hundreds of thousands of United Methodist churches in the distant future.
A new church has a positive impact in any community that it goes into. It creates a spirit among all churches that are there. The Holy Spirit tends to work within them all. They can foster and help one another.
It's like the snowball effect. As we keep growing, everyone gets more and more excited, and how can you not love that? It's wonderful.
It's Larry!
Our third area of focus is engaging in ministry with the poor. Billions of people around the world, most of them women and children, live lives of preventable suffering, perpetually at risk.
Somehow in our 40 years, poverty has become acceptable to us. We permitted ourselves to join the rest of the world in complacency. But here, at our 40-year anniversary, for the love of God, the United Methodist Church declares no more. And I ask you, what has taken us so long?
The root causes of poverty are unique, and we must work directly in partnership with our growing congregations around the world that seek to serve their local communities.
I am here because personally, this is my passion to serve the needs of my brothers and sisters.
By calling on our powerful connectional system, we can build appropriate institutions and policies to eliminate poverty around the world.
John Wesley wrote that solidarity with the poor includes not only a positive concern for their welfare, but a protest against concrete forms of injustice.
Our fourth area of focus is stamping out the killer diseases of poverty by improving health globally.
Reversing the pain and physical suffering experienced by the world's poor is a powerful, tangible method of serving as God's witness.
The statistics are staggering. More than 33 million people worldwide are living with HIV/AIDS.
We're afraid, when will I die? Will I die like my husband? Will I suffer? What will happen to my children?
Africa has 12 million AIDS orphans, and that number grows daily. Tuberculosis is the second most common infectious disease in the world and the leading cause of death among women and those with AIDS. Malaria is an illness that affects 40% of the world's population, and every year more than 500 million people become severely ill with the disease. What can we of Wesleyan descent do to change those statistics? By interconnecting the resources, capacities, and skills of the entire United Methodist community, we can help to significantly reduce deaths caused by the diseases of poverty.
And with Mr. Gates's match, this General Conference this week has raised $428,030.
The Nothing But Nets campaign has now raised more than $20 million total and proven how strong our denomination can be when we work towards a goal.
While we've been here, we have saved the lives of nearly 50,000 children.
We United Methodists face a time of great challenge and opportunity. As we reflect on these four areas of focus, ask yourself, what role is God calling you to play in the future of our church?
God is good all of the time.
Join us in the noble aspiration of making these four areas of focus the tie that binds all of us together, reconnects us to our Wesleyan DNA, and once again opens us to God's will.
May we, right now, in this very place, rediscover the power and grace of being a people united to follow Jesus Christ into the world from a church that is awakened and alive.
As you see from this video and the very nature by which it was presented, you begin to see that General Conference is moving away in some ways from being a purely legislative body to one of inspiration, to one of vision, to one that seeks in broad ways to direct the future of the church. And these four pathways are very important pieces for it. And in many ways, the very sense of General Conference is to sit around tables, and so that there is general conferencing together, discernment work that is done, more prayer has been introduced into these sessions, as well as large worship expressions of the church itself. A General Conference in its worship, in its prayer, its discernment can be quite a quite inspiring work of the Holy Spirit as a variety of voices, a variety of experiences come together from all over the globe to counsel together. But still, sometimes it even seems in contraposition to that is that you have basically a legislative session with all of Robert's Rules of Order that are there. And it feels over the last several quadrennia that the church very much is beginning to try to figure out how to discern more effectively as legislation, rather than having these kind of two separate spheres and figure out how they interrelate. But I have great hope for the future of the church. The other piece you will see in slide 4 that is very important for us to consider is whether it is possible for 1,000 people who are representatives of conferences from all over the world, which really stirs the democratic soul of having these representatives that are there. But the question is representative decision-making actually effective decision-making where we know that effective decision-making is generally done by a very small group of people. 8 to 12 is what basically the research tells us in terms of group organization and group dynamics and how leadership happens, that more effective versus more representative. And so when we become frustrated by the fact that the General Conference seems to be stuck in particular issues, like the issues of LGBTQ, which in terms of this, yes, democratically, it may be 60-40 or it may be 55-45, but basically it says that we can't see our way beyond a very frozen representative way of dealing with that issue that continues to tear at the church itself and becomes that central issue. And therefore, because of this large representative body that needs to be swayed in one way or another, it becomes heavily political, and advocacy groups and lobbying and all of the rest that comes with that in a natural way, because human organization has found no other way to deal with that adequately. That's our representative form of government, 1,000 people or 850 beginning in 2016 voting on a particular issue, and that is done vis-a-vis a more effective decision-making body, and thus the yearning of the council, perhaps, to have a set-aside executive, or a smaller group of people being the connectional table that would actually be able to direct the church. But even the connectional table, which was seen as a relatively small and vital group, perhaps even more in that 8 to 12 grouping, so that it would be an effective body, has now grown to a body of 60. And so that there is this yearning and this leaning in United Methodism that our legislative bodies are representative. And even when we attempt to become small, we are at 60 in the connectional table. Now, one of the conversations that was had in the Commission on the General Conference was to look at the number of people who represent 350 million in the United States and what is happening in Congress between the Senate and the House of Representatives. The number of representatives in those two chambers of Congress are in the hundreds to represent 350 million. We have less than 10% of that number that are in the United Methodist Church, and yet we have at least 2 times plus in our representative bodies. And so some of the conversation is around the size of the conference. You will see again in slide 4 that the bishops are the presiding officers, but they are not the executives. They are the presiding officers. As I said earlier on, there is that concern that the central conferences can modify the Book of Discipline contextually, but the United States conferences are not allowed to do that. On slide 5, you will see some of the restrictions of the General Conference. It is very important for us to understand that the only body that speaks for the entire United Methodist Church is the General Conference itself. The general agencies are only speaking for the General Conference when they are speaking according to the legislation of the General Conference, or which includes the Book of Resolutions. Boards and agencies in the interim, if there are new issues that come up, can only speak on behalf of that general agency, and it must be very clear that they are not speaking for the general church, for the church itself. The way in which legislation comes to the General Conference, and you will see this in the Book of Discipline, is that they are sent as memoranda to the secretary. The secretary then parses them out to various legislative committees, which happens in the first week. And the legislative committees shape the legislation which is to come to the floor either by consent calendar or for debate by the delegates of General Conference. And the political machinations around that are very important for us to understand, and they happen anytime there is a legislative body of this size and with this magnitude. Senator George McGovern, as I may have said in an earlier lecture, when of late memory, of blessed memory, and George McGovern actually did some of his studies here at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary before he went to the Senate, was elected at one point to be a delegate to the General Conference from the Dakotas area. And he, of course, brought great interest because he was a national politician and legislator. And he was asked after it was over what he thought of the legislative process of General Conference. And he basically blithely said that after the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, the United States Senate is actually child's play. And so it will give you a sense of how important but how complex this all becomes. On slide 6, you will see through many of the movements of the General Conference that inclusion continues to be a very important part of the United Methodist Church. And that in addition to agencies, boards and agencies that are given to do missional work, are given to do discipleship work, are given to do the work of advocacy in the world for our ethics and our basically social principles and higher education and ministry and all of those areas. The United Methodist Church is very, very committed to the issues of inclusion. And two of the general commissions, the Commission on Religion and Race and the Commission on the Status and Role of Women, basically express those commitments to inclusion in the church, not only in General Conference, but throughout the church and advocacy for those principles in the world. But very much so do you have the Commission on Religion and Race, the Commission on the Status and Role of Women. They are monitoring agencies at General Conference. Black Methodists for Church Renewal also serve in some of those areas, and now the General Board of Discipleship's emphasis and their division on youth and young adults also look to the inclusivity of various persons within the conversation and the debate at General Conference. And we also have what used to be an issue of inclusion within the conversation of ecumenical unity within the Christian church and interreligious concerns that used to be a general agency. The General Commission on Christian Unity and Interreligious Concerns has now been taken into the purview of the Council of Bishops itself because that is where the ecumenical officer is and the ecumenical work that goes on there. And if you will look again to these issues of inclusion and justice, and one of them is peacemaking within the church and conflict transformation within the church and the world, which may not sound like the same kind of inclusion as religion and race and the status and role of women, but it really is. And you will see in paragraph 2401 that now there is in Washington, D.C., the Just Peace Center for Mediation and Conflict Transformation. You'll see in slide 7 some of the questions that I think are very important that we will take up in the 12th session. And that is the federal system of government effective in carrying out our missional task? And that is basically a question that I would put to you as part of your reflection for the final paper. Is the federal system of government that comes to its greatest in the General Conference the most effective in our missional task? Is there another ecclesiology in our DNA that should get more attention or the focal attention rather than this very large body which sets our apportionments and our direction and the general agencies? And I'm pointing mostly to a spiritual connectionalism amongst what used to be the itinerants and the focus on itineration and the local societies with which they itinerated, this very local vitality together. Not congregational ministry, but in fact class meetings strung together for mutual support spiritually as well as missionally. And the other question is there a center in global Methodism? Or can we actually move to, and what would the complications be? It's easy to say, yes, we'll move to a global form of governance. But drill down on that. What would be the stumbling blocks and the opportunities, the difficulties, if we were unbounded from nationalism and nationalistic really forms that govern the way we are structured, and a truly contextualized United Methodist Church? Okay, that's the General Conference. And what I would like to say that in addition to the 4 pathways that we will see in now 4 more videos coming up, there have been in the last 2 or 3 quadrennia other emphases that kind of float together, and this is why the bishops were talking about a set-aside executive that would order and align them so they didn't see like they were out there, and they would take our attention from each other, so that you have very clearly these 4 pathways, and they're nested in 4 or 5 or 6 different general agencies, each of them having their ways of dealing with them. And so, and there are a variety of places that they play in the agenda of those general agencies and the way they're marched out to the church. In addition to those 4 pathways, you'll see in slide 8 that there has been this movement of vital congregations. And we'll talk with Amy Valdez-Barker about that, because she did some great work with the Vital Congregations move that had a directing group around it. And the Council of Bishops was very much focused on the revitalizing of the local church. They did a major study by a consulting agency, Towers Watson. They came up with 16 drivers of vitality and dashboards that gave you weekly numbers that you needed to put in for that. In other words, they were trying to develop metrics that churches would be held accountable for in terms of guiding those dashboards, as it were. And this is Bishop John Scholl, who is now in the greater New Jersey area, which really championed that work. And Amy basically served to coordinate a lot of that work under Bishop Scholl's directive. As a matter of fact, this picture on slide 8 of Bishop Scholl, when it was put out by the United Methodist Church, the tag that was on it as it became the JPEG that was posted out there is Bishop Vital Guy. And Bishop Scholl said you've got to reduce these things to metrics, and they become the dashboard. So you have the 4 pathways, and now the dashboards that are the indicators of vital congregations. We had a doctoral student this year, Cheryl Palmer, in the Illinois Great Rivers Conference, that basically said there is a gap in the Towers-Watson metrics, and Towers-Watson knew that, which is basically around how do we capture missional vitality. And so this dashboard may have a left or a right blinker that's missing that we need to deal with. And so the 4 pathways and vital congregations. And so as a transition to some of the other emphases of General Conference, let us watch another video that will introduce the church growth, or Path 1, in terms of these 4 pathways of the church. And Path 1 is nested in the General Board of Discipleship. So enjoy this video. So that was Pathway 1, church growth, the revitalization of the local church, the establishing of new church starts, and church growth. And we've seen great new church starts throughout the connection. In the Northern Illinois Annual Conference, Bishop Hisu Zheng took this in and began something called Vision 2020, which had to do with a number of new church starts. Bishop Sally Dick has followed him and revised that vision to Vision 2.0. We also know that out of the United Methodist Committee on Communications, we have, and you see this in slide 9, in addition to the 4 pathways, the vital congregations, you have the slogan of open hearts, open minds, open doors, with a great ad campaign. One of the critiques of that campaign is that it was beautiful, people enjoyed it, but that unlike other slogans and ad campaign, it hadn't been marched out to the constituency first. So many United Methodists, when they saw it on television, said, hey, that's really cool, what's that all about? And they realized it was about the United Methodist Church to which they belonged. And so this becomes sometimes the disconnection in our great connectional system. And again, and not that I'm in favor or not in favor of it, but this was the reason and the rationale for a set-aside executive of the church to make sure these things were marched out and done in a way that took in the best management practices, so that if we're going to have a slogan, if we're going to have a brand as a church, the greatest numbers of United Methodists would have known it before it hit their television sets while they were having breakfast and watching one of the morning news programs. Let's go back to slide 9 for just a moment, and you see, in addition to that open hearts, open minds, open doors, on the right-hand side, you've got that whole movement to rethink church, that we need to break out of the box. We have, the malaria campaign, and the number of malaria nets that we have basically used to eradicate malaria in the world, and any number of vital other projects that are there in addition to advocacy areas. So you see this vitality that comes out of the work of the general church and voted on by General Conference is very, very exciting in many ways, but sometimes confusing when it gets down to, in terms of this global church, many local churches say, well, what do we do with all of this stuff? In addition to, and you can read about these, the collections during the special Sundays that we have in the United Methodist Church and the like. So there's a great deal of vitality and energy, but the question of governance, in terms of how do you harness that the most effectively and march it out as a connected church and an aligned church is very important. And so let us move to what happens once General Conference is over. General Conference meets for 2 weeks. A special session of General Conference could be called in the interim between quadrennial meetings for a specific reason. And recently, there have been some efforts to do that around a couple of issues. One had to do with budget, and one had to do with the way in which the church was dealing with the issue of inclusion of GLBTQ persons. Both of those efforts failed on one very important ground, and that is to mount a general conference takes an awful long time. The delegates are delegates for a quadrennium, so that isn't clearly the greatest issue. But it is to choose a time, a site, to bring together all of those people, the costs involved, and so the balance between the issue and the cost is very, very important. So generally, they meet every quadrennium. But their work is carried out by established boards, agencies, and commissions of the church. And those boards, agencies, and the commissions of the church are basically incorporated in and of themselves. So the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, for instance, is a board chaired by a bishop, elected members by the General Conference, but is incorporated, and in this case, in the state of Tennessee for its work in the church. And so those individually incorporated general boards that are amenable to the General Conference, that carry out what the General Conference has told them to do, are amenable in that place, but they're accountable to their board of directors, elected by the nominating committee of a General Conference, but elected and in that place. Let us start on slide 10 with one of those, and that's the General Board of Discipleship. And one of the geographical games that I'd like to play as we move through this is, where are these boards located? And one of the things that may happen is, in a given quadrennium, a board will pick up and move. For instance, this new emphasis that I talked about on transforming conflict, the Just Peace Group, used to be right here in Evanston, Illinois, in the old General Board of Pensions building, and now it's in Washington, D.C. And the General Board of Pensions building is no longer in Evanston, but has moved to a brand new campus in Glenview, Illinois. One of the reasons was that it was cheaper, and another reason, it's closer to the airport, and it stayed here in the Chicago area because this is a general banking center. So location becomes very important in terms of the influence and accessibility of these boards to what they need to do. So I already gave you the answer for where the General Board of Pensions is when we get there. But the General Board of Discipleship is in Nashville. Nashville was the center of the Methodist Episcopal South Church, and is in a relative geographic center of the country, and so therefore many have referred to Nashville, because of the number of boards and agencies there, as the United Methodist Vatican. Others have said Nashville is a fine place to be. Vanderbilt University, which was Methodist connected. The Scarlett Bennett Center is there, which is United Methodist connected, is fine, except it's a secondary airport, meaning it's very difficult to get there directly from many other places. But it is historically the center of the old ME Church South. The other two places that you will find are important from the 19th century are New York and Chicago. And Chicago at that time was an upstart. But let's look back at slide 10, which is the General Board of Discipleship. And the General Board of Discipleship is a combination of several other boards that came together in the merger of 1968, which were basically of education and evangelism and discipleship into the General Board of Discipleship. And you will see and I would encourage you, each of these boards has a website, to go onto the General Board of Discipleship website and see how they resource the church. Many of you who are leading worship services on a Sunday morning will find that there are all your lectionary helps, and they can help you with hymn selection and exegetical work and other links that are there, because it is in discipleship that the worship section is there, and the Africana Hymnal Study Committee would be there, or the revision of the hymnal, or the new book of worship would come out of there. The United Methodist Men is housed as a separate commission, but has been historically connected there to the Board of Discipleship, which is different than the United Methodist Women, which has basically been connected to the Women's Division of the General Board of Global Ministries. So UMW, Global Ministries, UMM, Discipleship. And you'll see right there in the middle is Path 1. And that's where the upper room comes from, is Board of Discipleship. And if you're down in Nashville, to go to actually the Board of Discipleship, and then the emphasis on young people's ministry. So the Board of Discipleship is there in Nashville, and let's move geographically to the General Board of Global Ministries. And despite some efforts over the years to move this out of New York City, 475 Riverside Drive in New York, The General Board of Global Ministries, which has its national division and its global division, clearly divisions, and they're moving those names separately because they indicate national, United States, and global. As a global church, those no longer make any sense. It is at 475 Riverside Drive, right near Union Theological Seminary and Riverside Church, and I invite you to go up there. It's familiarly known as the God Box. There are many other denominations that have their missional societies there, and you've got some publishing activity that goes on there. And that is where our missionaries are commissioned and out of which they are resourced there at the General Board of Global Ministries in New York. That is where missions here in the United States are developed. This is where UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, has its housing. And you should know much about UMCOR, which usually works with the Red Cross, with Catholic Charities, with Lutheran Relief Services, and with the Salvation Army. Many times if there's a national disaster, especially in the United States, but now it's becoming global, UMCOR will be there. And that's when those appeals go out, every dollar that is taken in by those appeals for specific things goes exactly to those. UMCOR's overhead is taken care of by One Great Hour of Sharing and other solicitations. It's a great piece. So missionaries and all of those matters. And we'll play another video around global health. This is coming with the eradication of malaria, imagine no nets, and those kinds of things. And so let us sit back and listen to one more of these four pathways. Quite a mission for the church. And it is one of the four pathways and has become a successful piece of what we do. When the church rallies around specific missional outreach programs, United Methodists have risen to the challenge. I think back in my own life toward just the dream of Africa University in old Matare, Zimbabwe. And the thought was that it would take at least 2 quadrennia to raise that money. And the initial ask was done in less than a quadrennia. The idea of building that university, endowing that university, and now continuing to support that university. Imagine no nets, the eradication of malaria in the world. And many of those things are very important to us. And so let us go from GBGM, the General Board of Global Ministries in New York that reaches out to the world, to the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, which is our 12th slide, and that's located again in Nashville. And it does several things, but they're really focused on higher education and ministry. And so most of you will interface with the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry around your entry into ministry at some level. When you enter candidacy, it is GBHEM that developed the candidacy materials that you use and oversees the training of those who are candidacy mentors. If you are moving through the orders of elder and deacon, this is where the monitoring agencies and the kind of rules of the road, if you will, are developed and supervised, is at GBHEM. This is where the scholarship money comes from that supports many of the students who move through ministry training. This is where the Ministerial Education Fund, which basically supports our 13 United Methodist seminaries, comes from. This is where the higher education, the United Methodist colleges and universities, and you should see the list of them. United Methodism or Methodism was very intent on building institutions of higher education, and throughout the United States and the world, to have a United Methodist or formally Methodist affiliated school, and they are coordinated there at GBHEM. This is also where the United Methodist Endorsing Agency is for those who seek to go into chaplaincy, hospital chaplaincy, military chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy, and the like, and they are endorsed in that place. Kim Cape is the General Secretary of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, and you will see her there on the 12th slide. Let me say a note about, in the middle of that 12th slide, you will see paragraph 1400s. As you move through here, and I'm sorry I didn't say this earlier in the lecture, you will see that I've basically put the paragraph range for these general boards and agencies. And some of you may say, why is half of the Book of Discipline taken up with the description and the governance of the general boards and agencies? It is because the General Conference basically is entrusting to these general boards and agencies what it legislates to do, and it seeks a way to regulate their work together. And so, out of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, we will play our next Pathways video, which is a focus on the developing of leadership. Enjoy this video. And now we welcome you back from the development of leaders that was focused in GBHEM in Nashville, and we will move to the 13th slide, and you will see that this is the General Board of Church and Society, which is neither in New York nor Chicago, nor is it in Nashville, but it is in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. became in 1939, when the merger occurred between the old Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, it was determined that the United Methodist Church, or the Methodist Episcopal Church Methodist Church at that time, had to have a formative voice in the very heart of the governing of this country. And so one of the most important buildings that the United Methodist Church owns is the Methodist Building, and it's on Capitol Hill. It's a coveted piece of real estate, as you might imagine. Very, very expensive. People would be willing to pay top dollar for that. It's right next door to the Supreme Court and right across from the Capitol itself. Many people complain that it's a lobbying agency for the church. The reality of the case is, it is a lobbying agency for the church. Its commission primarily is to advocate, to inform, to educate the legislators of this country around the priorities of the United Methodist Church, to have a voice in the gate, if you will, of the city in what is happening in this country that affects so much of the world. They are governed by the social principles, as you will see in that 13 slide in the lower left. They talk to the movers and shakers of this country. You will see in the lower right, that's Hillary Clinton, who as First Lady, as Senator, as Secretary of State, and she is a United Methodist, was advocated and met with the General Board of Church and Society. There are some United Methodists who choose not to meet with the Board of Church and Society, and it took an awful long time for the General Board to gain entry into some of the administrations in the White House, particularly the Bush administration, George W. Bush. But eventually, George W. Bush did invite the President of the Council of Bishops and representatives of the board to be part of what they were doing. And you will see in the upper left-hand picture of that 13th slide, that's Bishop Trimble of the Iowa area and Bishop Minerva Carcano, who was from the Desert Southwest Conference there, who were protesting at the White House and were arrested. And Bishop Sally Dick, as I record this, is ready to do the same around issues of immigration. And so let us play, I believe it's the final video on ministry with the poor. I want to now move to two agencies of the church that are remarkably different than all of the other ones that we will talk about in this way. All of the general boards, agencies, and commissions that come out of General Conference are supported by apportionments. The budget that is voted by General Conference and then apportioned according to a specific formula of ratios and membership and the like to the annual conferences, which are then apportioned to the local church. And each annual conference has a different formula by which it apportions to the local church. But all of the money that is apportioned by General Conference, and it's added to by the annual conference and then apportioned to local churches, supports the General Commissions, boards, and agencies that we've talked about, except for these two, which you will see on slide 14, and that's why I've put them together in the same place. One is the General Board of Pensions, and that is at the lower portion of the slide. The General Board of Pensions is located here in Glenview, Illinois, not far from Evanston and not far from the seminary. It is that historic center of the Chicago area, which was basically located in Chicago and Evanston, which is why Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary is here. It's tied to the Chicago Temple, tied to First United Methodist Church in Evanston. And this was known in some ways as a Methodist utopia in the middle of the 19th century. And Evans was one of the leading Methodists at the time. And so two boards and agencies were here at the advent of the United Methodist Church, had been here since 1939 with the merger of the old MEC and the ME Church South. And that was the General Council on Finance and Administration, which has since moved to Nashville We'll talk about that in a moment. But also the General Board of Pensions and now Health Benefits. Pensions and Health Benefits. We have one of the largest nonprofit pension funds, and especially of religious denominations in the world. And it is under investment here. And because Chicago is a international banking center, it was thought important to remain here by Chicago and by O'Hare Airport. What makes that unique, General Board of Health Benefits, is it is not supported at all by the General Conference. It is amenable to it. Its pension plans must be voted by it, but the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits is here in Glenview, and it must generate its own support through its investments. And the General Board of Health Benefits and Pensions and Health Benefits basically manages all of the pension money that comes in from the various annual conferences, which comes from the apportionments to local churches. It also then must, according to a very strict social screen and monitoring that is based on the social principles, hear that there's a whole office in the General Board of Pensions to make sure that your pension money, that money is invested according to certain social principles in terms of prohibitions. The companies cannot make so much money in alcohol, tobacco, pornography, military armaments, and the like. But also they are moving in a way where they make very positive investments, such as housing for the poor, that they actually in very proactive ways invest in places that are positive to the church's commitments and missional places. But the point for this slide, slide 14, is the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits generates its own support. The same is true with the other agency that is here that goes by several names. Most importantly, it's the United Methodist Publishing House, otherwise known as Cokesbury. The United Methodist Publishing House is that which publishes official United Methodist documents, such as the Book of Discipline, the United Methodist Hymnal, the United Methodist Book of Worship. And so if you look at the publications data, the United Methodist Publishing House is basically what General Conference tells it to publish. But the United Methodist Publishing House, that's just a very, very small amount of its publishing endeavor. It is Cokesbury, which is the umbrella that is there, which is made up from the names of Bishops Coke and Asbury from the very beginning, and their focus on education and being agents of the Methodist book concern. And so therefore, publishing and the advocacy to sell and buy books within United Methodism is very high. And so we have the name Cokesbury for the two bishops, Abingdon Press, which is named after a formative school in England, and so Abingdon Press is there. Kingswood Books, which is an other arm, and there are several others of those. Kingswood's Books, which is the academic arm and publishes scholarly works, comes from the Kingswood schools outside of Bristol. They too must generate their own support through their publishing endeavors. And so that's what joins the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits in the United Methodist Publishing House together as one. The 15th slide, just a couple of more. There's the General Commission on Communication, and basically much that is the advertising, the website, and many other things that attempt to communicate the word come from the United Methodist Commission on Communications. The other piece, oh, by the way, the publishing house is in Nashville. I forgot to say that. And the General Council on Finance and Administration is also in Nashville. It used to be here in Chicago to be closer to the General Board of Pensions, so all of the money basically came to one place. It was about 8 years ago that it was decided that they would abandon their site here in Evanston, And clearly as an Evanstonian at this point, that's the way it felt, that we've been abandoned. But the then General Secretary of GCF&A felt that it was important to be closer to the majority of our larger boards, which would be Board of Discipleship and Board of Higher Ed. And so the General Board of Finance, or General Commission on Finance and Administration, went to Nashville at that time. Now, let me say a few words about GCF&A and what they supervise. Basically, they develop the forms that are used across the church, but that's a minor part of what they do. They basically administer the 7 funds. I believe that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I thought I had counted them rightly. These are the 7 apportioned funds that are developed and established by the United Methodist Church. And I want to simply review those funds and then basically review the money piece of that. Number 1 is the World Service Fund. Now, the World Service Fund basically is about our missional endeavors throughout the world. It is one of the most vigorous missional funds throughout the mission and ministry of the ecumenical church. And out of a budget of $603 million per year that the United Methodist general agencies and the general church spend, $603 million, a little over $300 million of that goes to the General Service Fund, which encourages evangelistic efforts and missional efforts throughout the world. The second largest fund is the Ministerial Education Fund, and you can see the historic commitments to mission and ministry and discipleship and evangelism throughout the world, and education. And we spend a little over $90 million in the Ministerial Education Fund, and it helps persons to answer the divine call. And you can see the cost of education in the United Methodist Church to prepare pastors and leaders for the world. And that is really quite an important piece. And when you think about it, the Ministerial Education Fund was developed because there was a concern that the church would not fund the support and education of its pastors. There are pastors that are retiring now in our lifetime whose education at seminary or the course of study school was completely supported by the church. And as you know, it is no more. We have here at Garrett Evangelical a budget that is somewhere around $14 million. $1 million of that, at the current rate, is being funded out of the Ministerial Education Fund. So 1/14. In real dollars, when this seminary was formed, the old Garrett and the old Evangelical came together to be Garrett Evangelical back in 1972. The general church gave us exactly $1 million. So since 1972 to the current time, the general church has funded us at $1 million a year, where the cost of education has actually skyrocketed. So although we are very grateful, and we're all grateful for the $90 million that comes into the Ministerial Education Fund, it clearly does not keep pace with what is necessary and what is needed there. And so therefore our seminaries, at the very least, are needing to do an awful lot more independent fundraising from those who are dedicated to this mission and ministry. So here we have World Service and Ministerial Education Fund. And then there is the Episcopal Fund, and the Episcopal Fund is also $90 million. I'm sorry, Ministerial Education is $100 million. The Episcopal Fund is $90 million, and that is about the work of the connectional ministry through the bishops. We are also dedicated to 11 United States historically black colleges through the Black College Fund, which is about $43 million. We are also dedicated to interdenominational work, And our interdenominational work is about $8 million per year, which helps with the National and the World Council of Churches, as well as many of our ecumenical endeavors. Africa University, which was at one time a solicitation of the general church, has become a dedication of our work to the tune of $9.5 million a year. And the balance, a little over $8 million, goes to the general administration of the church. All of that adding up to $603.1 million a year that is raised through apportionments. Now let me say a word about that. $603.1 million is apportioned by the General Conference for the quadrennium to the annual conferences and then to the local church. But the reality of the case is the general church only expects to receive 86% of what it apportions to the annual conferences. And so therefore we're in this very difficult and slippery game of, if this is what we apportion, this is what we expect, and we will spend even less so that we don't overspend ourselves. That is a church that is basically having trouble keeping its budget in line, perhaps, but I would recommend that more to the case is that we are having a harder and harder time interpreting and communicating what this money goes for, because many of the projects that are basically funded by these various areas of the church are things to which people would rise and give money in a new and different way. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really research what goes into all of these funds and to interpret them broadly to the United Methodist Church. And finally, I would like to come, we're not finally just quite yet. Sometimes I get hung up in the money and don't get on to the last couple of pieces that I'd already mentioned. Slide 16 will show you the two monitoring agencies, the General Commission on Religion and Race, which finds itself in Washington, D.C. It was in New York for a while. GCORR is a monitoring agency as well as an advocacy agency for the inclusion of persons in various ethnic and racial groups. And the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women is as its title bears. You will see COSRO is also interested in things that affect women very deeply, and they conducted a study and have a handbook on United Methodist parsonages, which I would commend to you all, advocating for the housing of clergy. I would also say that the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women was deeply involved in research as to why women who have come into the ministry basically leave the ministry at a rather alarming rate, and what were the causes of that. And that study was done with the Anna Howard Shaw Center at Boston University School of Theology, and it's on both of their websites, both BU School of Theology's website and the COSRO website. 17 will show you where our archives are. So if you do any research in the archives of the church or seek its history, it's collected in a very nice facility at Drew University in New Jersey. It is concerned about our heritage and interpreting that heritage. There it has a huge collection of original artifacts and books. So if you're doing any research to find your way to Drew University and to that place, many of your annual conferences have archives in history where they collect local pieces that come from local churches and local events. They also are an agency that does two things. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner of slide 17 a memorial medallion that can be ordered and placed on the headstone or the footstone of United Methodist clergy. And in the lower right, they are responsible for United Methodist historic sites. And so those are the general boards and agencies of the church. Taken all together, and you will comment on this, it's a lot to take in, and it is, but to sit back and just take it all together, and you will get a very clear picture, I believe, as to where the efforts and the energies of this great church have gone over the years. That we are not just a collection of local churches doing local ministry, although that is vital, and it is the first place in the Book of Discipline. We are not just an annual conference where many of us meet together and find our membership and our connection, but we are a general church with general commitments and large investments in these various places. This is our DNA as it is proclaimed across the church. And we are trying to figure out how we can align more effectively this DNA so that it more effectively will carry out the mission and ministry of the church. And it is that alignment, that communication, that bringing together that is envisioned in the establishment of what is seen on slide 18, our last slide of the day, the connectional table. And we are blessed to have, as a PhD student here at Garrett Evangelical, as well as the general agency or the connectional table, which really is not an agency, you will notice, nor is it a board, nor is it a commission. It is connectional and it is a table, sacramental in its sense of how we come together to conferencing, connectional in its very kind of paleo primitive, at the very core of who we are as Methodists, the connectional table. That its General Secretary, Amy Valdez-Barker, is here and with us, and she will be here for an interview, and we will discuss the connectional table as well as vital congregations in a couple of weeks as we gather for class. So the general church, of which we are all a part, the conference and its agencies, it is a great expression of the ministry and mission of the Church of Jesus Christ that attempts to embrace the globe for Christ's sake, for making disciples of Jesus Christ, and for the transformation of the world. God bless.
To convey